Thank you, Susan. It's very nice to be here again. Over the years, I've done quite a number of presentations here at the Institute, and I think that's because the plan is to keep inviting me back until I finally get it right. Today I'm going to talk about a cognitive rehabilitation program that was developed by a group of scientists and clinicians at the Rotman Research Institute. Some of you with a good memory might remember that a couple of years ago I gave a talk here with the same title. At that time we had just completed an evaluation of our program, and I think I presented the results of our preliminary analysis. So since then, the analysis is complete, and I'm going to report the final results, which, by the way, were published in a series of articles in the Journal of the International Neuropsychological Society. It's part of a special issue, and I would refer you there if you would like to have more details that I'm going to be able to provide in this presentation. A project like this is a major undertaking and could not be accomplished without an exceptional team, and we were very fortunate to have such a team. I think it would be appropriate to begin this presentation by acknowledging them. First and foremost, my co-coordinator, Dawn Stuss, who was largely instrumental in our getting the grant that made the study possible. We had a terrific group of scientists, including basic scientists like Gus Craig, who is known to this institute and who is internationally known for his work in human memory. Brian Levine, Ian Robertson, and Deirdre Dawson are more applied scientists who have strong backgrounds in the area of cognitive rehabilitation, and we were very fortunate to have two outstanding behavioral neurologists on the team, Sandy Black and Nick Alexander, who also have done a lot of work in the area of rehabilitation. The success of a project like this depends largely on a group of talented postdoctoral fellows. And we had that group. They had a variety of roles, including acting as group leaders. In particular, I want to acknowledge Heather Palmer, who was the first postdoctoral fellow we recruited for this project, and who was instrumental in putting together the initial protocol for this program. The research assistants were a marvelous group. They're the ones in the trenches. They're the ones who work directly with the participants. They administer the test, they record the data, they help analyze the data, and do whatever else is necessary to make progress in this work. And Malcolm Binns, you can't say enough about Malcolm Binns. At the end of the study, we had a mountain of data, so much so that most of us were totally overwhelmed by the numbers and the data that we had to work with. And Malcolm, as our statistical consultant, helped navigate us through these data and help us extract data that we could interpret in a meaningful way. The project itself has kind of an interesting history. It goes back a number of years ago when we made cognitive rehabilitation the theme of one of the annual conferences that the Rotman Research Institute puts on. It's not that we were doing so much work in the area of rehabilitation at that time, but we were interested in knowing what was going on in the field and to see if any of the basic research that we do might in any way relate to programs such as this. It was a very successful conference, I would say, but it was also a very frustrating conference, because speaker after speaker would get up and talk about the problems in the field and the lack of progress that was being made. Several speakers complained about the lack of generalization. Sure enough, there were frequent reports of improvements on specific tasks following various interventions, but these benefits did not necessarily generalize to other tasks or other situations. So it was one thing to help people learn a list of words in the lab, But it was quite another thing to help them remember a shopping list when they got to the supermarket. And that was one of the problems with the results of some of these programs. Outcome measures were questionable, frequently consisting of subjective reports and clinical observations. There was all too often a lack of formal assessment, and when there was, it didn't include measures that related to real-world performance. And that's very important as well. There were a few clinical trials, but for the most part, they were not well designed, and they often lacked clinical control groups. Rarely did clinical trials have long-term follow-up to see if any benefits that were expressed shortly after the program actually persisted for a period of time and affected the way people lived in their daily lives. Interestingly as well, subject selection was almost always a problem in these trials. The samples frequently weren't representative of the samples of the population they were targeting. Health status was not always well verified, and surprisingly enough, the trials did not often or always take into account other medication that the participants were receiving or other forms of treatment. So any benefits that people seemed to receive, it was often difficult to tell whether these benefits could be attributed to the intervention or some other treatment that they were receiving. And finally, the programs that were available at that time were designed primarily for cognitively impaired people with traumatic brain injury. Now, such patients often have severe cognitive impairment, but it's a stable condition. And so these programs are really unsuitable for older adults and individuals with progressive cognitive decline, people with diagnosed, for example, with mild cognitive impairment or in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease. The programs would often extend for very long periods of time, which created the very real danger that the rate of decline in individuals like this might be greater than the rate of benefit that they could derive from the program. Well, after the conference, a few of us were sitting around and reflecting on some of these comments, and I think I may have been into my second martini when I blurted out loud in the group that, I thought that despite our lack of experience in the field, we probably could do as good a job as some of the so-called experts in the field. Somebody else in the group heard that and observed that the McDonald Foundation had actually identified, this is a granting agency in the U.S., that actually identified cognitive rehabilitation as a priority area for funding. And so if we really thought we could do a good job, why didn't we put together a proposal? Dawn Stuss, who was in the group and who was the director of the Rotman Research Institute at the time, those of you who know Dawn, some of you might, will know that he's never seen a grant application that he didn't like. And the next morning, a task force was set up, and we were charged with the responsibility of putting together a proposal to develop a protocol for a cognitive rehabilitation program. And we got to work, and we worked on the proposal for several months. And from the beginning, we resolved that the program that we ultimately developed would contain a number of key elements. We wanted it to be comprehensive in the sense that it would address the range of cognitive processes that are affected by brain impairment, and also take into account the personal and social difficulties that cognitively impaired people frequently have. We wanted it to be versatile so that it could be adapted to various populations with cognitive impairment. And that's important, which is not to say that we didn't appreciate that the cognitive profile of people suffering from a stroke was the same as people in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease or people suffering head injury. But there are common elements in these patterns of cognitive impairment. Almost all individuals have a certain degree of memory loss. Almost all individuals also have a certain degree of what is known as executive function, the ability to solve problems in a strategic, organized way. So our plan was to build our protocol around these key components, and then tweak the protocol and adapt it to the various populations as required. We wanted the program to be based on solid scientific principles, and so in putting it together, we drew heavily on relevant research findings and current thinking in cognitive neuroscience and rehabilitation practice. We wanted the program to have a high benefit to cost ratio, and we were committed to submitting the program to a rigorous clinical experimental trial to evaluate it under conditions that were as controlled as possible. Well, we put together the framework of a program, and almost to our surprise, we got the grant, which meant that we really had work to do at this point. And so we started recruiting our staff, and we put together, we spent a couple of years putting together a protocol that looked something like this. It was a 12-week, three-part modular program. Now, the fact that we wanted it to be brief for the reasons that I indicated before, but when we consulted with various experts in the field, we were told that that was absolutely impossible. That 12 weeks was nowhere near enough time to develop a program that could have the kind of benefits that we were looking for. Nevertheless, we persevered because we felt that it had to be short to maintain the motivation of the participants and also to deal with the problem of people who had progressive decline. The program was administered in a group format with 5 to 6 individuals in the group. They met once a week for 3 hours in sessions that were semi-structured. Semi-structured in the sense that each session had a fixed agenda such that the group leader always provided a set amount of information according to a devised program. But at the same time, the program was intended to be highly interactive, to allow the participants to interact directly with the group leader and to interact with themselves. And I think that this component was actually a key factor in the success of the program. I think recognizing when individuals with a particular problem recognize that there are other individuals with a similar problem, and that they could work together to help each other, to empathize, to support, to be sympathetic, that helps to develop a very good chemistry within the group. And I think contributed to their motivation, to their willingness to work. And they really did have to work. A major part of the commitment was completing home-based assignments, which they took from each session and had to complete in time for next week to report on their progress. And the good feeling that was generated within the session was undoubtedly a factor, maybe the most important factor in the positive results that we obtained, but we certainly picked up on that and made sure that that was built in permanently into our program. We were a little concerned that because the sessions, the program was administered in group format, that it might be limited in terms of its personal, in terms of the personal contact. So to address that, we built in a series of individual meetings between the group leader and participants. And these meetings allowed participants to identify long-term goals, what they hope to get out of the program, to discuss progress over the course of the program, and even to deal with problems as they arose. I said there were 3 components. There was a memory training module, a practical task training module that was adapted from Brian Levine and Ian Robertson's goal management training program, and a psychosocial training program. The memory, in the memory training module, the aim was to reacquaint the participants with strategies that are appropriate for learning and remembering new information. This module was based on research that showed that older people and people with brain damage do not spontaneously use the mental strategies that young normal adults do when trying to learn, we do automatically when trying to learn and remember something. It's not that they've lost these strategies, it's not that they don't know these strategies, they just don't apply them. It seems that now it's necessary to make more of an effort to recruit those strategies than was necessary earlier on. So we felt that our challenge here was to get subjects to make the effort that was necessary to invoke the strategies that would support learning and remembering. And we did this in the following ways. First, we began by helping people to achieve a better understanding of the nature of memory. We emphasize the fact that there isn't just one form of memory, there are many forms of memory. Some are more susceptible to others as we age normally and to the effects of brain damage. We talked a lot about the importance of attention in learning new information, solving problems, and remembering old information. The basic principle, it's so obvious that it's surprising that we lose track of it. If we don't pay attention, then information is not going to get in. If it doesn't get in, it's not going to get out. It's a very basic principle, but it's one that we felt we had to hammer home to get the point across. We also didn't hesitate to present some of the research that supported the particular approach we were taking in devising our protocol. This is a study that was conducted by a group of scientists at the Rotman a number of years ago. It's a PET study that shows the areas of brain activation in the course of recalling lists of words in young and old adults. The important thing to note here is that both the young and the old adults are remembering the particular list equally well. But look, there are different patterns of brain activation. In the young people, there is a direct pathway between frontal lobes where the strategies for performing the task are initiated, and the more medial parts of the brain where the information is recalled. It's reasonable to infer from that this is a fairly automatic process from a neurological point of view. But look at the pattern in the older adults. Remember, the older adults are doing just as well, but you get a very different pattern of brain activation. You get much more bilateral activation in the frontal lobes, which probably means that more of a conscious effort is required on their part to do the same thing. They have to consciously draw on some sort of organizational principle or whatever is required in order to solve the task. If they do that, as these people were, then they'll do as well as the adults. Expressed in terms that the participants can understand, that make quite an impression on people. It means that there's legitimate scientific evidence to support what we're doing, that they might benefit from following the program. But equally importantly, I think, it conveyed to them a measure of respect. We felt that we're telling them we felt they were able to understand the rationale that they were a part of the process, and understanding why we were doing it was as much a part of it as anything else. We then went on to talk about the various strategies or external strategies, such as writing things down, using post-it notes, keeping a diary, even using electronic managers. Clearly very helpful. Many of us do it regardless of our mental condition or our age. It's a very helpful thing to do. But we were particularly interested in encouraging people to use internal strategies, forming association with material to be remembered, using imagery as much as possible, deep encoding. By deep encoding, I refer to the process of processing information in ways that are as personally meaningful as possible. Lots of research to show that we are much better at remembering information that means something to us rather than information that is abstract or unrelated to anything that is important. And there's lots of work to show this, and we would, again, refer to research that makes this point. This is a study involving 3 groups of older adults who were asked to learn a list of words according to one of 3 strategies. One group was asked to pay attention to the letters of the words, whether they were in lowercase or capital. That's considered very shallow encoding. Second group was asked to form a rhyme with each of the words, and a third group, the deep encoding group, was asked to compose a sentence with each word, a sentence that was personally meaningful to them. And then you can see that when they were tested in recalling the list of words, the group that was instructed to encode the information most deeply was the group that performed best, 80% accuracy. And again, when the participants could see that by following some of the directions that we were providing, that would translate into superior results, that made quite an impression. Incidentally, if there are any questions as I go along, please don't hesitate to interrupt. I'm very aware of not having a monopoly on clarity and lucidity, so by all means, stop me anytime you like.
Well, I had one question. How did you recruit the people that participated?
Right. I will get to that when we talk about this. Okay. In the practical task training component, the aim here was to extend these strategies from the clinic, shall we say, to the real world, and also to help the participants plan and implement the kinds of tasks that they routinely encounter in everyday situations. So here, the emphasis is clearly on real life, everyday goals, and the objective was to teach participants through a series of progressive steps to better identify, attend to, organize, and execute large and small tasks. So we asked people to identify the various components of a task. We talked about the need to focus and sustain attention on what they were doing. We talked about the importance of dealing with distraction. In the real world, you don't have complete control over what happens. You might not be able to ignore the telephone in the middle of performing some task. You might have to go to the telephone. You might have to answer the doorbell because it might be something important. Very important to keep in mind what you were doing before in order that you get back to it and carry on where you left off. We also talked about multitasking because, again, in the real world, you don't have the luxury all the time of just doing one thing at a time. You often have to do several things at the same time, maybe as part of the task, or maybe just because you have to engage in conversation while you're performing a task, and you can't lose sight of what you're doing. But unless you are consciously aware of the need to keep these various things under control, it's very easy to lose control. And often when there are distractions and you aren't sufficiently attentive, it's very easy to lose track of where you are in the task. And it's important as part of establishing the correct strategies to make sure that people were aware that these issues do arise. Do you have a question?
I know when you're dealing with people with dementia, whether it be Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia, part of their problems is identifying the steps of a task, or the sequencing of these steps of a task, or knowing how to stop and start the components of the task. Is this happening also to people who are having mild memory problems?
Absolutely.
So they're starting to relate in these ways that they're not quite being able to break down the steps of the task. It's not just they're not remembering the task.
And there are a lot of reasons for that. I mean, first of all, there is a certain amount of neurobiological decline that would account for wandering attention and not sticking to the task. But there are also psychological and psychosocial factors. Older adults, people with brain damage whose lives have changed dramatically, aren't as engaged. They aren't into doing as many things as they once were. And as a result, when they do take on a task, they don't do it with the same focus and the same degree of involvement as they otherwise might under other circumstances when they were younger or whatever. And as a result, their performance suffers from that. And when performance suffers, it's kind of a vicious circle begins to take effect. When you no longer do as well at what you try to do in terms of confronting problems and cognitive challenges, you start taking on fewer cognitive challenges, and you get worse. The process accelerates. It accelerates.
But another reason that they might not be focusing so strongly, but the focusing rather than the actual ability to do the task is where I'm not quite sure. But one of the reasons that they can't focus is because they're grieving the multiple losses that they're dealing with on a daily basis, and so their focus is very distracted. But again, so they're also losing the ability to piece out the task that they need to do.
Exactly. Okay. And a big part of our program is aimed at precisely developing that focus, making sure that they aren't trying to do too much at a particular time, which is not to say that they shouldn't be prepared for unexpected events in the course of performing a task or solving a problem, but be realistic in terms of what one takes on and what one can do. And so, as I said, in identifying the various components of a task, they are dealing with the task in manageable units, and that's very important. Also, keeping the manageable units together so that one builds on it, and that's very important. I thought what you were getting at is how we would get demented people to respond to a program like this, and of course, a program like this is not designed for people whose cognitive impairment is so severe that they can't follow
focus on what you're even saying.
Right. But one of the potential benefits, and this is an issue that probably needs a lot more investigation, is that if one can raise the level of function for a longer period of time, then one can contribute to the process of delaying the process of cognitive aging, and also keep the person functioning at a higher level so that when new interventions, when new medical treatments come online, they're better candidates. They're better candidates.
So it's just, I guess it's very natural that the lead up to Alzheimer's is kind of memory loss, but I never kind of connected them that way, that, you know, and I know it's not, because dementia has many other forms, but it seems to me that the same things, what you're saying is the same things that are the problems for people with dementia are the beginnings of problems with people who have memory loss.
A lot of severe forms of cognitive impairment begin with what appears to be relatively benign memory loss, and then the memory loss becomes worse, and related cognitive problems begin to appear. The related cognitive problems are sometimes hard to gauge because people who suffer memory loss and become aware of it and whose lives are affected by it frequently begin to back away from activities and engagement in their lives that would cause them to, which accelerates the process. So things begin to work on each other in insidious ways. What you end up with are people who have memory, well, not what you end up with, what develops very quickly is an individual with memory loss and an inability to develop an appropriate approach to dealing with specific problems. And that's the real focus. We don't have any, we recognized early on that we weren't going to be able to increase the number of brain cells. We probably couldn't increase the absolute memory capacity that an individual has. But we felt that by getting people to use strategies that were appropriate and use them efficiently, we could get them to optimize the abilities that they do have. And that was really the focus, to get people using strategies that were right for the situation.
But they don't adapt well also. That's another side of it.
Well, that's another, well, and that's what, maybe I'll just move right on to that. And that brings us to the psychosocial component, which we added after considerable consideration. The psychosocial module was based on research that Morris Moscovich and I did quite a number of years ago, at a time when we were interested in non-biological factors that contributed to cognitive decline as part of normal aging. And we did a series of studies that looked in particular at the impact of so-called psychosocial and lifestyle variables on cognitive decline. And we did a series of studies, and we consistently found that people who were most active, people who felt that they were in control of decisions that affected their lives, people who were optimistic, people who scored high on our happiness scales, people who felt their lives were meaningful. These people consistently performed better on tests of cognitive function than people who scored lower on these attributes. This was true for people living on their own in the community, people who were relatively normal, healthy, active people. It was also true for comparable people who were living in nursing homes or various kinds of institutions. Now, the interesting thing is, even though there weren't differences medically or in terms of other inclusion or exclusion criteria, people in institutions always performed at a lower level on our cognitive tests than people living at home, and that's part of another story. The point is, the relationship between cognitive function and psychosocial status was always the same in both populations. The other thing that was interesting about this research, I think I presented some of this work during those times, was that when we tracked these relationships over a period of time, we found that if there was a loss, if someone experienced a loss through death or a change in their lives or some traumatic experience that caused their affect or their mood to be affected, there was a corresponding drop in their cognitive function. When the crisis passed and people's lives was restored to normalcy, there was a corresponding rise in their cognitive function. So clearly there's an intimate relationship between the psychosocial factors and cognitive function in old age. So we decided that we'd better include a psychosocial component in our program. And the theme here, the aim here, was to enhance self-esteem, which we felt was a problem, not just in old people, but in people who suffer brain injury or have neurodegenerative diseases and aren't functioning as well. So self-esteem could very well be a problem. And also, there is a need to build confidence in these people's cognitive abilities and in their ability to take on new cognitive challenges. So we included that, and we did this by, first of all, emphasizing or describing the psychosocial attributes that we felt were particularly important and contributed to an overall sense of well-being. We talked about the research that showed a relationship between psychological well-being and cognitive function, and we explained how everything was related to each other. You know, a big challenge is getting people to reflect on what's happening to them. So if people solve a problem or successfully completed a task, the simple question, well, how do you feel about your accomplishment? They think about it, I feel pretty good. I feel pretty optimistic that when I'm asked to do a similar problem in the future, I can probably do it. That contributes to a general feeling of well-being that also feeds into a much more confident approach in taking on the next challenge. And so while feeling good about oneself is certainly going to help in terms of cognitive performance, successfully accomplishing a cognitive task is going to contribute to a sense of well-being, which in turn, you see how the circle completes itself. And when people began to realize, it's very energizing to recognize that one can actually grow in this way, and one can be a contributing factor to that growth. So in this particular module, we had one of the assignments was to ask people to go home and find a long neglected task that they've always wanted to do but never got around to doing it. This is in the trial that I'm going to tell you about in a second. The task that most people reported as one that they had neglected and wanted to get back. Can you guess what that might be?
Sorting of photographs.
Right. You've heard me talk about it.
No, but I'm just thinking, the people in that
absolutely.
sorting something.
And that's a very challenging task because there are many ways of doing that. And you can sort it chronologically, according to family members, according to activity, all kinds of ways. And a lot of people just get bogged down in trying to develop a strategy, trying to formulate a way that to proceed, and they end up going nowhere. But a lot of people took that on. One gentleman, a charming fellow, decided that he was going to pick up on an activity that had been a part of his life for many years, but which he had never gotten around to. He had always been in theater, and he'd always wanted to write a play, but he never had the opportunity. And as he got older, he lost the confidence to develop to write that play. But he was very engaged in the program, and that's what he chose as an assignment. And we were a little concerned that this might be a bit ambitious for him, and we encouraged him to go slow. But he was determined, and then the following week he was to come back and report on his progress. Well, he did. Right in the first in that 1 week, he wrote, I think, one complete act of that play, and he was delighted to be able to report back and give us a reading. And we all listened very attentively, and he was so pleased. And so it was a terrible play. It wasn't funny where it was supposed to be funny, and it was funny where it wasn't supposed to be funny. It really, one didn't have to be a theater critic to realize that this was probably never going to see the light of day on stage. But it was a tremendous accomplishment for him, and of course he got all the reinforcement in the world. He went on to complete that play, and I actually had the opportunity to meet up with him sometime later, and sure enough, he had finished the play. It didn't matter that it never got performed, but he accomplished that very important task. Okay, so what we had put together was a multi-dimensional model with all components integrated with each other and with the overall aim of improving cognitive abilities generally. When we had the protocol put together, we ran a series of pilot studies. We tested out various populations. We worked with a few stroke patients, head injury patients, older adults, people in early stages of dementia, very early stages of dementia. We tweaked and revised the program even more and felt at this point we were ready to conduct a legitimate trial. We decided, mainly for reasons of expediency, to conduct that trial on a sample of normal older adults who experienced normal memory decline. They were not pathological or diagnosed with any dementing condition. They were older adults who were suffering the kind of memory loss that normal older adults will experience. And I think someone asked
yes,
how we selected. At Baycrest Center, we have a large population of volunteers. So we drew heavily on our volunteers, and we also, recognizing that the sample at Baycrest is not necessarily representative of society at large, we also recruited through ads in supermarkets and in various ways so that we'd have a reasonable cross-section. So it wasn't a large sample compared to some of the other trials that have emerged since we did this, but it certainly was large enough to provide the kind of information we wanted. So we conducted it on 49 older adults. They were between the ages of 71 and 87 years old, and they were all relatively healthy, which is to say that while they had the usual array of aches and pains, as you might well imagine, they weren't suffering from any kind of condition that would adversely affect cognitive function. They weren't taking the kind of medication that would slow down brain function or affect their ability to perform cognitive tasks. They were all community dwelling. We were interested in institutionalized old people, but because it's clearly a different population, and one never knows if in institutionalized people you aren't dealing with some people who had preclinical symptoms. They might be in the early but undetectable stages of serious cognitive decline. We decided to restrict this trial to people living on their own in the community. And to ensure that they were all functioning within the normal range, we made sure that on our screening tests, like the mini mental state and the NARC, the Boston naming test, that they scored within 1.5 standard deviations of published means for their age. The design is a little complicated. I won't go into great detail here, but just to emphasize the major relevant features of it. It was a randomized, within control crossover design. Randomized within subject crossover design. And within that design, we randomly assigned people to an early training group, and a late training group. And the design was really set up to ensure control over as many key factors as possible, and also to enable as many meaningful comparisons as possible. So I emphasize the early and the late group for a variety of reasons, and one of them will appear, will be quite clear in a short while. When the subjects were assigned to each of the groups in the trial, they were immediately administered a battery of neuropsychological and psychosocial tests to establish their baseline performance, to establish how well they were performing prior to receiving the intervention. The early group then went into the 3-month rehabilitation program. The late group went into a control program where there was some contact with the group leaders, but there was no active intervention going on at that time. Immediately after the 3 months, both groups underwent another round of neuropsychological and psychosocial testing. Now, at this point, we predicted that the early group, by virtue of their having participated in the rehab program, would perform better than the late group, which had not experienced the program. Right? In addition, we expected that the early group would perform better post-training than they had pre-training. So we have the between-group comparison and the within-group comparison. As far as the late group, since they only underwent the control procedure, we didn't expect any differences between the test results at this point and the performance at baseline. After that round of testing, the late group went into the rehab program, while the early group underwent the control procedure. Another round of testing, and here the predictions were that the late group would now improve the level of performance, and there should be no difference in a between-group comparison between the late and the early. And now the late group should be performing better than they did prior to the rehab and better than they did at baseline. Whereas the early group should show no difference, hopefully they didn't show any decline, but no difference between the performance in this round of tests and their performance just after the rehab. And then we also had a 6-month follow-up, where we were very interested to see in how well any benefits held up over time. All right, well, as you can imagine, as I said, we had accumulated an enormous amount of data. I will not burden you with the full set of data, but I'd like to give you just a sample of the types of results we obtained in each domain. We had tests in the memory domain, in the practical task planning domain, and in psychosocial function. And I'll just give you a sample of the kind of results that we obtained. In the psychosocial domain, one of the things we did was to put together a composite index of what we consider to be psychological well-being. And this was made up of various attributes, various psychosocial attributes that correlated well with each other. Attributes like locus of control, optimism, and happiness. They clearly measured the same things. They didn't correlate perfectly with each other, but because they all correlated significantly with each other, there were common elements. Putting them together, we considered that we had a measure that reflected overall well-being. Here are the results on this particular composite index. What I'm showing here is the index for the early group. That's supposed to be red, actually. Something about transferring between computers. The composite index for the early group and the late group at baseline, immediately after they underwent the program, and 6 months later. Now, the first thing to notice is that, first of all, at baseline, this was a statistical construct, so it was designed so that the indices would be 0 at baseline. But the early group clearly had improved in terms of psychological or psychosocial well-being, psychological well-being, but the late training group did very badly on this measure. This was as pleasantly surprised as we were here. We were, as you can imagine, a little bit dismayed with the results of the late group. Let me reassure you, we did not turn our late group into mental cripples or anything like that. This was not an effect. This is an extreme example of an effect that we obtained a few times, but definitely not every time. Nevertheless, there were enough instances in which differences favored the early group that it gave us cause for concern, and I'll come back to that. If you have any thoughts on what may be happening here, I'll...
Just to clarify, they did worse on both sets of tests even after the training than they had done from the baseline, or Why is what does that negative thing actually mean?
This means that their index of well-being went down relative from.
So it is a negative, yes.
It's a negative.
And
right.
they started at 0.
They started at 0. Yes, they started at 0. There was no difference on any of our measures at baseline between the early and late
So
groups.
the green one, the post-training, they went through the control, which was like nothing, no
Right. Then they
training. And so they went from 0 with a to
Right. Now, don't get too distressed about this, because as you'll see, we didn't always get that result. In fact, occasionally, our late group actually did a little bit better than our early group. I'm showing here some other test results, and from here on in, I'm showing the results a little differently. So please pay attention to this. What I'm showing you now is the percent improvement in the early and late group relative to baseline immediately post-training and 6 months later. So this is the change, this is the percentage of change after the intervention relative to before the intervention. And what you can actually see is that on this particular scale, which is really a measure of mood, the late training group actually did a little bit better post-training and things evened out over the long term. On the dysexecutive function test, again, there's no difference. This is a very interesting test, by the way. This is a test that measures people's ability, that measures the strategies that people follow in responding to cognitive challenges in a social context. So we're very interested in this because we want to see if the increased use of appropriate strategies generalized to social situations. And you can see that here we have a 15% improvement initially in both groups, and then 6 months later it actually goes up to a 35%. Now, we consistently get at least as good performance 6 months later or improved performance. And this was very gratifying because what it means is that the strategies that they learned during the sessions and practice at home, they continue to work with these strategies even after the program had completed, and they got better at dealing with various cognitive situations as time went on. So that's one of the major problems with some of the results that have been reported in the literature, that benefits do not extend for a long period of time, and we find that. But notice here, no differences between the early and the late group. This is a measure of coping styles, and it's one of the measures in which the benefits were relatively small and they were clearly restricted to the early group. The late group did not show any improvement on this particular measure. So maybe we should pause and reflect what is going on here with the late group. When they have problems, why are they having problems? And we really struggled with this. And the best idea we came up with is that despite our best efforts to prepare both groups for the programs and the schedules, we may not have been sufficiently clear with respect especially to the late group that there was going to be this delay. We told them there was going to be a delay, that they would begin the program in a few months. We may not have been sufficiently deliberate in making sure they fully appreciated this. They were very motivated at the beginning. They were recruited, and they got all the propaganda and all the enthusiasm, and we did all the necessary cheerleading to ensure their commitment, to ensure their involvement. And that may have worked against us when the highly enthusiastic late training group couldn't understand why the program wasn't getting going. It may have affected them in some adverse way. It may have affected their motivation. We know, for example, what happens to older adults when they're on waiting lists. People go on waiting lists, for example, to relocate to institutions. Their cognitive performance and their mood goes way down, and then it gets even worse during the adjustment process when the relocation actually takes place, and then hopefully there will be a gradual recovery. We think that maybe something like that was going on, and it may have affected their performance, but it didn't affect it consistently. It was selectively, and so we're not married to that idea, but that's the best explanation that we could find. Do you have a better idea?
Oh gosh, I wish I could.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to clarify something you say. You said that people who are on a waiting list to go into care, whether it be a nursing home or whatever, their level of cognitive abilities decreases. Is this, do you think, because of their fear of going into the nursing home?
Yeah.
It's
I think
not
it's
just
anxiety.
waiting.
It's anxiety related to the process. I think it's the anxiety about making the necessary preparations, all of this they have to do, the uncertainty of the future. I mean, I don't think that there is a significant biological change that takes place when they get the call from the nursing home. When they get the call, they usually get about 3 weeks or something like that to do all the necessary preparations. So that's very challenging.
It is very.
And it's it's a big change, and it's a change that's taking place at a time of life when most people are not equipped to make drastic changes.
And so many changes.
I think when people's expectations, when older people's expectations aren't realized, that could be potentially very stressful.
I just think it's the engagement and the lack of control. I mean, you brought all these people together and then nothing happened. So then you just kind of tune out. You committed, so you keep going and so on. Whereas the other people, the early people, you engage them immediately, and then you get the reinforcing mechanism.
Although, to speak to that point, when they actually did get to the program finally, they were motivated. They worked very hard. The effect was variable, so it may have affected different people in different ways at different times. So it may have been there, but it didn't seem to be there in any kind of predictable way, except sometimes it showed up, and it showed up quite dramatically. Other times, in other tests, it didn't show up at all. But I think somehow it affected them in a way that was different than the early group responded, and we don't quite understand that way just yet. Sorry, did you have a question?
Oh, I was just going to make a point about the waiting list for getting into long-term care and the decline, perhaps related to depression and stuff like that, because they're moving into a devalued social position and a time frame closer to the end of life expectancy. So there would be some sadness.
Yes, absolutely. And as I understand that literature, the process is a gradual one. When people go on this and stay on the list for an extended period of time, it's not something that they are obsessed with or preoccupied with on an enduring basis. But it's a process that accelerates when the word comes that it's time to make the necessary preparations.
But as you were talking about that, the parallel I was thinking about is people who at a much younger age are candidates for drug rehab, for example. I mean, people talk about adolescents and who can't get into a program. So they're motivated to get into a program for some reason, and then they can't get in for 3, 6, 9 months, whatever. So as you were saying that about your early and late, what came to my mind was people who for some reason decide to make a change and then can't do anything about it.
Yeah. It was something about the delay, because that was the only difference between these two groups. So clearly, we think that they responded to that delay in ways that we didn't.
But I think that could be generalized to anybody trying to take control and make a change if there are lengthy delays. And
of course, we're always dealing with vulnerable populations. Right? Just a couple more to show you that how people did in the other. Here are some of the couple of the cognitive test scores. This is a test of memory, short-term memory, long-term memory, using recall and recognition measures. You can see early on here the late training group is actually doing better than the early group. But over the course of time, the early group continues to benefit from the late. They stay good, but there's a bit of a drop. Incidentally, in this business, 15% improvement is considered very good. And you can see that we're consistently getting much better performance than 15%.
The post-training, is it the same amount of time? Or
Yes. Well, when the tests were administered,
right, you're saying this is post-training.
Yeah.
So I know the ones that started later.
got it.
So is it the same period of time after the training that both are tested?
Yes. Right. Okay. Now, we selected most of our tests because they allowed us to measure the strategic processes that were being recruited in performing the test. Remember, we were interested in the use of strategies as much as we were interested in overall performance. This is a pretty good example of that because the lists of words in this particular test can be learned according to a variety of strategies. One is simple rote learning, just memorizing the words, which is the least efficient strategy. Or you could devise some internal strategy. You can organize the words in some way, or you can cluster the words according to categories because there were 4 words belonging. There were several categories with 4 words in each category, so you could learn the words according to the category, and that would help people in learning and remembering. We measure the use of strategic processes, and you can see that the early group in particular showed dramatic improvements in their use of appropriate strategies for the task. This is an awkward slide, but it shows a decline in their use of the least efficient strategy, the rote learning strategy, and particularly over the long term. The early group was not using the rote learning strategy nearly as well. Interestingly, that although the pattern of the late group was in the same direction, they weren't doing quite as well on this. Although, as you can see, they did pretty well with the better strategies. They continue to use, to some extent, the less efficient strategies. This is a test of memory where they had to recall details from a story that was read to them, and you can see the early group in particular did especially well, performing initially over 40% and holding on to that pretty well. The late group didn't do as well initially, but they did begin to improve over the long term. We were very interested in how they did on the practical tasks, and here there was good improvement in both the early and the late. The early group especially held on to it over the long term. And equally gratifying was the fact that they were making very efficient use of task-appropriate strategies. The early group, again, doing somewhat better than the late group. They were also, in a very strategic way, checking their performance, correcting their errors, monitoring all the time. Very important for successful performance. It's being attentive. It's focusing. So that's a sample of the kinds of results that we've obtained with this program. Needless to say, we've been encouraged, and so we've been we have a number of studies going on in follow-up. With the continued support of the McDonald Foundation, we've just completed a study of patients with white matter disease who are at very high risk for stroke. We've built in structural and functional neuroimaging into this trial. We're looking at the pattern of pathology in these people that would make them good candidates for rehabilitation. And we're also looking at changes in brain activation patterns after the intervention to see what parts of the brain are now active that may not have been active previously. We just received a grant from the Canadian Institute of Health Research to do a study with patients diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment. Of course, you know that mild cognitive impairment typically converts into Alzheimer's disease in about 35% or 35 to 50% of people with mild cognitive impairment go on to develop Alzheimer's disease, and we're very optimistic about that. And what I hope to do someday, and this is kind of a dream, is actually to combine our rehab program with individuals who are on some of the cognitive enhancing drugs now. The rationale being that by combining the two, we may get benefits that are greater than those associated with each individual treatment on its own. But by combining them, we may get that much better performance. And ultimately, the hope is to extend the period of high-level functioning for as long as possible and keep these people going and good candidates for any of the interventions that come along. So thank you very much for your attention. I think I went a little over time, but that's partly because you were asking so many good questions. Thank you very much. If you have any other questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Could you just give us an example of an executive task that you might have been trying to train them on?
A real world type
Yeah, because
task?
I understand the list of words converts into shopping list, but the executive tasks.
Sure. One task would be planning a trip, where there are a number of considerations to keep in mind: cost, when, where to go, how long to go. When you're managing a number of variables to put together into a package, there's a lot of planning, a lot of organization going on, a lot of accommodation. If there are other people involved, you have to take into account their preferences. And there's a lot of effort that's required, and certainly a lot of organization and planning, and a certain amount of skill. Without the ability to plan and anticipate the consequences of any decisions, it's going to be like a random activity. Organizing a carpool where different people have to be picked up and different people's responsibilities assigned and scheduled. The same kind of thing. Fixing an appliance, where you have to do things in a systematic, planned way, requiring certain tools. Some things have to be done before other things can be done. It takes a lot of planning and what we call executive function. People with frontal lobe damage are very poor at those kinds of tasks. And the frontal lobe is one of the areas, sadly, that's affected even in the course of normal aging.
We have a question from the webcast audience.
Really?
Yes, if I might read it out. She's talking about the slide that you showed at the beginning when it was showing the activation of young versus old brain activity. So she's wondering if your team has worked on projects with fMRI, I think functional MRI, before or after training. Are you planning to? What do you expect?
Well, she was probably typing in the question when I was explaining that we've actually just finished the study with these patients with white matter disease that includes structural and functional imaging. One of the things we are currently doing is comparing the brain activation patterns of people who underwent our training program with their patterns prior to the training pattern. So the answer to that question is yes, and we're in the process of analyzing those results.
Come back.
Should be looking. Yes.
Is it possible that these two groups had differences among the individuals that would have more of an effect than just whether they were in the late or the early group?
Well, we certainly looked at that. That was our first concern.
That would be the obvious.
That would be the obvious. But in terms of age, neuropsychological function, health, socioeconomic status, education, all of the variables that one normally takes into account in designing these studies didn't reveal any differences at all.
Was this repeated at all? Did you do this test once, or this group test? Or did you do it on more than one set of groups? In other words, could you repeat this and get the same result?
Well, we haven't replicated the study with another group of older people.
Okay. would be
we are.
interesting to know if you got the same
But I think her question is more, if your groups were 5 or 6 people, how many early groups did you have and how many late groups did you have? Was it only one group or multiple groups?
Well, we had several groups. Sorry, we had several groups of 5 or 6 in several small groups of 5 or 6 in each of the learning and late group. Is that what you were asking?
No.
I think you were asking whether we've repeated these results in a different sample of early and late training. Yeah. No, we haven't done that. But we've continued to modify and hopefully improve the protocol so that we are now testing a group of older adults with mild cognitive impairment who are more impaired than our older people were. We've also built in a different way of preparing people, the early and the late group for the program, to monitor their awareness of the schedule and to make sure that they understood and so on. We're trying to take that into account. It's a bit challenging to. The study of this goes on for quite a while, and I think we're going to leave the replication with older adults to other people while we move on to other populations.
I'm sort of digging back into past interests, and I can't remember now. Is it the Hawthorne effect that was done with the population of I don't know, some company or other who was monitored? Are you?
I am, and I'm searching the results through.
It's where they thought there was excuse me, there was an experiment done. Does anybody remember the whole?
I think it had to do with the employer taking an interest in staff and just any change in hours and working conditions. It really didn't matter whether it was a change for the better, a more favorable change or a less favorable change. Staff performance and morale went up. And so that was what they sort of said, that paying any attention to somebody makes them feel better, was kind of the conclusion.
That's right. I remember now, one of the examples was, does it make any difference whether the walls were green in the room or the walls were red? Well, it appeared to make a difference if they had been freshly painted, but that wasn't the point.
Right.
The point was, as you were saying, the attention that was being paid. So that relates back to what you were saying about how you prepare these people.
I think related to that question, it's very important to ask what aspect of the program could account for most of the benefits, if a particular aspect was more important than others, or whether there was a kind of combined effect of all 3 components. We don't know the answer to that question yet. We also don't know whether the single most important factor wasn't the terrific chemistry that was generated within the groups. And maybe they just felt so good in participating in this activity that it transformed them in some way and changed the way they functioned on a day-to-day basis. I'm kind of dubious about that. I don't think those kinds of benefits last, well, I don't deny them, I don't think they last as long and permeate so many different areas of one's life.
I see what you mean.
So we do believe that the benefits that people showed and persisted were the result of changing people's approaches to dealing with cognitive challenges.
Which was then reinforced by the group in the early stage. I mean, you really had 2 things happening. So my feeling would be that the group itself tended to reinforce the learning and improve on the learning because it had tools that they got in the earlier intervention, which the second group didn't have, and they didn't get the tools till later.
Which may be a good argument for group programs. People are concerned about that because, as I said, the personal element is sometimes lacking a little bit. And a lot of these long programs are often one-on-one, virtually one-on-one programs. And maybe some of the limited success of those programs is due to the lack of sort of external reinforcement, the lack of social facilitation that very often occurs in the right kinds of groups. And of course, the group leaders are very important. The temperament and style of the group leader in engaging people and motivating them is very important. And we recognized that very early, and we encouraged our group leaders to be as upbeat and dynamic as possible, to allow that aspect to potentially work for us. Yeah.
I wouldn't discount the empowerment so much. You know, it's an amazing thing. A group could empower each other, and especially with something like aging, which people feel or did feel is inevitable, and they would just sort of lie down to it. And you've now put together a group that maybe you didn't empower or totally empower, but they, with what you were doing with them, they empowered themselves. Okay, we can make a difference here. We can change what we thought was inevitable to something where it's...
So I would put that into the sort of psychosocial background, which is one of the things we did. Interestingly, that while there was a pretty good dynamic between participants in each group, those weren't lasting relationships. They didn't become friends or anything like that.
I don't think it's needed. I think it's a change of attitude that the empowerment could have done, and then that could have lasted.
Sure. Okay, thank you very much.